Hi everyone, welcome to your online lecture that's going to be covering the cardiovascular system, but the basics of the cardiovascular system. And so what we'll be looking at today is primarily the anatomy or the structure of the human heart, as well as the function or the physiology of the human heart. We'll have a look at some of the names of the different vessels that exist as part of our cardiovascular system. And then we'll look at how the heart in itself is able to beat. Before we get started on the details, I wanted to show you this slide because it's a really nice overview emphasizing the fact that the heart acts as a double pump. And so if we look at the heart here, you can see that this area is filled with blue blood, so the right side of the heart, and this area is filled with red blood, so that's the left side of the heart. And so each in itself, this right side is one pump and this left side is another pump, but they function at the same time. And so what we'll learn happens is we have this blue blood here, and of course blood isn't actually blue, but it's representing deoxygenated or poorly oxygenated blood. And so after tissues in our body have used up all of the oxygen, then this blood, poor in oxygen, is going to reach the right side of the heart. It's going to then be pumped to the lungs, and it's at the level of the lungs where this reoxygenation occurs, where all of the red blood cells are going to be picking up oxygen, and of course it's the oxygen that we breathe in that enters our lungs that will end up diffusing into our blood vessels and attaching themselves to red blood cells. Then, once the blood is very heavily oxygenated, it leaves the lungs, it travels back to the heart, but this time it's entering the left side of the heart where this oxygen-rich blood will be pumped out with strong force to the rest of the body to supply all of our tissues with the blood that is required for survival, so nutrient-rich, oxygen-rich blood, and then that cycle continues. But how does blood get to the heart, out of the heart, to the tissues? Well, it's through our circulatory system, so involving blood vessels. And I've listed here on the side some of the different blood vessels that blood travels through. We have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And so what I'll point out to you in this diagram is that the arteries are going to be the larger vessels that carry oxygenated blood. So here we have examples of arteries, larger vessels coming right off the heart carrying oxygenated blood. But these vessels end up getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and once they start to get smaller, they change their name to arterioles. Then, once we get down to the level of the tissue itself that's going to be supplied with this oxygenated blood, the vessels are called capillaries, and you can see this network of vessels. These are the capillaries, and this is where the diffusion of oxygen from the vessels into the tissue is going to occur. Then, once we have already taken out all of that oxygen, well, now there's less oxygen, a lot less oxygen in the blood vessels, but now the body also needs to get rid of, or the tissues need to get rid of carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide will then be dumped into this end here. So we can say that this is the venous end of the capillary bed, whereas this is the arterial end of the capillary bed. And so then these capillaries will take this oxygen poor blood that also has carbon dioxide out of the tissue, will bring it into larger vessels. And so first we have venules, and then as venules get larger, they change their name to veins. And then blood will enter the heart this way. So you can see then that arteries and arterioles, as well as the arterial end of the capillaries, carry oxygenated blood, whereas the venous end of the capillaries, the venules and the veins, carry deoxygenated blood. So where's the heart located? Well, if we look closely, you can really see that the heart is located in the center of the chest. Now, that might be surprising to some of you because you've probably just assumed that the heart was located on the left side of the chest. In addition to that, when people sing the national anthem, they put their hand on the left side of their chest, representing their hand over their heart. But the reason people have thought that the heart is on the left side of the chest is because you can see here that the left part of the heart there's more of a bulk of it towards the left side. Now, one of the ways you can recognize the heart as being the left component or the right component is based on this part here. This is the apex of the heart. And you can see that the apex of the heart, or the bulk of the heart, is primarily on the left side of the body when we divide right down the midline. And then this top part here of the heart is actually called the base of the heart. So we have the base and we have the apex, and the apex is angulated towards the left side of the body. So that should help you when you are looking at the heart to recognize what structures are the left side versus the right side. Next up, we're going to look at the layers of the heart wall that make up the heart. If we were to dissect it or cross-section it and look at it closely, what layers are involved and what's their role? So here's a cross-section for us to have a closer look at the layers that make up the heart wall. To orient yourself, this is the outer part, so this is what you're seeing here, and then this would be the inner part. So this is actually what comes into contact with the blood that's in the heart, that's moving in and out of the heart. The main layer or covering of the heart is called the pericardium. Always try to break down words when you're talking about anatomy and physiology to help you understand rather than memorize. Cardium refers to the heart. Anytime you hear of cardiac, cardium referring to the heart. Peri means around. So this is the covering that surrounds the heart, is the pericardium. So it wraps around the heart. But you need to be aware that there are different layers of the pericardium. The most outer layer, that real tough outer layer, is called the fibrous pericardium, made of fibrous tissue. So that's this layer here. One layer in now, we have the parietal pericardium. So here's this layer, parietal pericardium. Now, if we move a little bit deeper in, you can see that there's another layer called the visceral pericardium. So let's highlight what we've gone through so far. We have stated that of the pericardium, that layer that surrounds the heart, we have a fibrous layer, the most outer, then we have a parietal layer, and then we go a little bit deeper, and we have what's called a visceral pericardium. The visceral pericardium also has another name called the epicardium. Visceral, anytime you hear visceral, think of organ. So the visceral pericardium, or the epicardium, this is the actual layer that surrounds and is in contact with the heart organ itself. That's why it gets the name visceral. And so this is where we're now attached, this covering is attached to the heart. Moving in a little bit deeper now, we have what makes up most of the heart organ that's covered directly by that visceral pericardium is the myocardium. Myo means muscle, cardium means heart, so this is the heart muscle, and you can see how thick it is. And we'll see shortly that certain areas of the heart are going to have a thicker myocardium depending on how far it has to pump blood. So it's going to have a thicker, stronger muscle if it needs to pump blood to further areas in the body. And then finally, we have the endocardium. The endocardium, this is the layer that is in contact with the blood. So this is the most inner layer. Okay, so working our way backwards then, the most inner layer is the endocardium, then we have the myocardium, and then we have the epicardium. So we could say then that the myocardium is surrounded in the most inner region by the endocardium, and the most outer region, or on top of, that's where epi comes from, the epicardium, or the visceral pericardium. Moving further out now, we have the parietal pericardium and the fibrous pericardium. The final point to make is that we have what's called a pericardial space, and all it is a space that exists between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium, and so it's called a pericardial space, and it's a cavity, and it's there for a reason. It's there because it houses a small amount of fluid that helps prevent friction as the heart layers and the heart in itself is moving. Remember when you learned about the different types of muscle tissue that exist, that one of the types of muscle tissue is called cardiac, the other two being skeletal and smooth muscle. And cardiac muscle we'll see a little bit later, has what are called tight junctions that exist. And the main point I want you to take from this slide is that the design of the heart muscle itself is in such a way that when electrical messages are sent along these muscle fibers, they can move in a very fast pace. And this allows the heart to contract very efficiently, very effectively. And what will come up towards the end of this lecture today is that in order for any muscle to contract, so including the heart, there first has to be an electrical signal sent to that muscle, allowing it to contract. And it's the existence of these tight junctions that allow for this to occur very fast and very effectively. And this image here on the right of the screen shows you again that outer covering. Hopefully you can appreciate that pericardium surrounding the heart. But then of course if we look closer we can see that it's made up of various different layers that comprise it. You can also see the relationship now of the lungs to the heart. And you can see a structure here called the diaphragm, which is a muscle that plays a very large role in our ability to breathe, which you'll learn about when you get to the respiratory system. So now what we're going to look at are the chambers of the heart. And these are almost like cavities or areas where something can reside. In this case, it's blood. So the chambers of the heart contain blood. So before I talk about the pathway that blood moves through the heart, I'll go through and show you the different chambers. This upper chamber here is referred to as the right atrium. So the atrium are the top two chambers. So this one would be the left atrium. And you would know if it's left or right, not just based on the color of blood moving through it, but because I told you that the apex of the heart points towards the left. So that tells you that this is the left atrium. The bottom two chambers, the larger chambers that you can see are surrounded by much larger muscle, are called the ventricles. So we have the right ventricle, and then we have the left ventricle. So those are the chambers of the heart. The atria at the top, we have the right and left atrium, the ventricles at the bottom, the right and left ventricles, where blood really moves through the heart. The next thing I'd like to point out are the names of the different vessels that are involved when it comes to the heart. So what we have first to be aware of are pulmonary veins. You can make note so that you are able to remind yourself later that when we talk about veins with the heart, we're talking about blood moving to the heart. So associate heart veins with blood moving toward the heart. Okay, that will help you when you learn the pathway of blood through the heart. So those are pulmonary veins. You can see that they exist on either side. And it might make sense to you that the reason they exist on either side is because we have right and left lungs that are going to move blood to the heart. And it's a little bit deceiving in this diagram, but hopefully you can visualize that these veins here would actually bring blood into the heart here. So this here is joining in with this here, and these veins here are bringing blood into the heart. So you can see they're bringing blood then into the left atrium. Another structure to point out to you is the pulmonary arteries. Anytime you are talking about arteries when it comes to the heart, this is referring to blood that's actually moving out of the heart. So A for artery, A for away from the heart, whereas veins are bringing blood toward the heart. The term pulmonary means or refers to the lungs. And so hopefully it might make sense to you then that these pulmonary arteries, which we know bring blood away from the heart, are going to bring blood to the lungs. And we have one on either side because we have two lungs. The next structure to point out is called the aorta. This is something that many of you have probably heard of before, and the aorta is a very, very large vessel, strong vessel that undergoes a lot of pressure, because if you think about it, when the heart is pumping blood into this vessel, it's going to be under a lot of pressure. But the aorta is a type of artery, a large artery. And we know that arteries, like we talked about with the pulmonary arteries, bring blood away from the heart. So this is going to be blood that's pumped out of the heart to the rest of the body through the aorta. Finally, in terms of vessels, we're going to have a look at the superior and inferior vena cava. You should make note now that when we talk about the vena cava, we're talking about veins. That's where vena comes from. And these veins, if you remember, we spoke about veins already, and we said that with the veins, when it comes to the heart, it's bringing blood to the heart. So the inferior and superior vena cava then are bringing blood to the heart. You remember the terms superior and inferior to mean above and below. So we have the one that is located above and the one that's located below. One thing that's a bit tricky when it comes to talking about the heart and vessels is that, well, first of all, we know that veins, when it comes to the heart, bring blood to the heart, and we know that arteries, including the aorta, bring blood away from the heart. But whether or not they carry deoxygenated or oxygenated blood is going to depend on what structure we're talking about. But when we talk about all of the other arteries away from the heart in the body, they carry oxygenated blood. And the veins in all other areas of the body carry deoxygenated blood or poorly oxygenated blood. But it's a little bit different when we talk about the heart itself, as we'll talk about shortly. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the valves of the heart. And these are really doorways that exist that allow for blood to move from one chamber to the next chamber to out of the heart. From one chamber to the next chamber to out of the heart. We need these valves. And we'll look at these on the next slide. So these are the approximate location of where the valves are located. And these are the four valves that exist: the pulmonic, aortic, bicuspid, and tricuspid valve. We're going to look at it in a more relevant way on this next image. You can see on this image here, we know that this is the inferior vena cava, this is the superior vena cava, and we know that this is the right atrium. We know that this is the right ventricle. So how does blood get from the right atrium to the right ventricle? Well, it will pass through a doorway that's called the tricuspid valve. How does blood then move from the left atrium into the left ventricle? Well, it moves through a valve called the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. It gets its name mitral because it resembles a bishop's hat. So bi for bishop, mitre for mitral. In addition, tri means 3, bi means 2. So you can see that with the tricuspid valve, we have 3 connections here. And with the bicuspid valve, bi meaning 2, we have 2 connections here. This is where the heart valve is connected to the heart wall. Just to put things into perspective again, this wall here that we're looking at on the inner part of the heart. So we've cut the heart through a frontal or coronal section, and we're looking at the valves, but this layer here, if you remember from the heart layers, is called the endocardium. The final thing to point out about these types of valves is that they're also called the atrioventricular valves. Very simple to remember because these are valves between the atrium and the ventricle. So atrium, ventricle, atrioventricular valve. Atrium, ventricle, atrioventricular valve. And of course, it's more appropriate then to say that this is the right valve and this is the left valve. I'd also like to give you a way to remember that the tricuspid valve is found on the right side of the heart. I used to remember it because the RI in tri and the RI in right, the right side of the heart. Chordae tendineae, these are the structures that I spoke about briefly earlier that actually connect the valve to the heart wall itself. So those are the valves that allow blood to move from the upper chambers, the atria, to the lower chambers, the ventricles. But remember, blood also has to move from these ventricles out of the heart. And so that's where we have a different type of valve that exists. Finally, we'll look at these two valves called the pulmonic and the aortic valves. And these are collectively called semi-lunar valves because they resemble a half moon, at least somewhat. And you can see that they're located here. The pulmonic valve is located in the pulmonary artery. Remember, we talked about these. So this is the pulmonary trunk, but this is the pulmonary artery, which we know brings blood away from the heart to the lungs. And then we have the aortic valve, which is located at the level of the aorta, which we know brings blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. So once again, as a repeat, what we have is a tricuspid valve and a bicuspid valve or mitral valve. These are collectively known as the atrioventricular valves because of their location, which allow for the movement of blood from one atria into the ventricle, the corresponding ventricle. And then we have the pulmonic valve and the aortic valve, collectively called the semilunar valves because of the shape that they take on, which allow for blood to move from the ventricles out of the heart, from the ventricle out of the heart. And its destination is going to be dependent on what side of the heart that blood's coming out of. So if it's coming out of the right side of the heart where we know we have this deoxygenated blood, then we know it's going to be traveling through these pulmonary arteries away from the heart to the lungs to be oxygenated. If it's the left side of the heart that we're talking about, this oxygen-rich blood is going to be pumped out of the heart through this aortic valve and into the aorta where it travels to the rest of the body. What we're going to do next is put everything that we've just spoken about, so all of the anatomy of the heart, including the chambers and the valves and the vessels, and show you the movement of blood through the heart. Let's return to this diagram that we looked at the beginning of the lecture to put everything together. Let's start. I always like to start with the blood that our tissues have already used up the oxygen. And so if we say that we have this deoxygenated or poorly oxygenated blood that has carbon dioxide in it that is within this venous system, it's going to need to get to the heart. Why does it need to get to the heart? Well, it needs to find its way back to the lungs in order to be reoxygenated. So we have all this deoxygenated blood that travels to the heart. And you can see here that this is venous system here. It's going to travel to the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, where it's going to be dumped into the right atrium. From there, this blood is going to push through past what we know is called the tricuspid valve or the AV valve and end up in the right ventricle. From here, it's going to move from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve, which is a type of semilunar valve, where it enters the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary arteries, as we spoke about on the last slide. So let's just show you that here. So this is where the pulmonary trunk is and the pulmonary arteries, one to each lung. It's just not explicitly shown here on this slide. So here is the pulmonary artery, which is going to take that blood to the lungs, where it's going to pick up oxygen that we breathe in, and it's also going to drop off carbon dioxide, which we'll breathe out. Once it picks up the oxygen, it's going to leave the lungs, and it leaves through, remember, the pulmonary veins. So let's go back to this slide here, and you can see or remind yourself how those pulmonary veins look. So these veins then are bringing blood from the lungs back to the heart that's now heavily oxygenated. And so these pulmonary veins bring blood where back to the heart? Well, specifically into the left atrium, where blood will then move through this valve here, which we know is called the bicuspid or mitral valve, also known as the atrioventricular valve. And it will move then into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then pump blood through another valve that you can see here. And this is called the aortic valve or the semilunar valve. Blood will push through the aortic valve into the aorta, where it will travel to all the different tissues in our body that need blood, oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood for survival. And then we also should remember that as arteries become smaller, so this aorta is a large artery, as arteries become smaller, they're called arterioles. Then once they get to the level of the tissue, then we have all of these networks here called capillaries, and this is where we drop off the oxygen, drop off the nutrients, then pick up carbon dioxide and even waste products. And now this blood is oxygen poor. It's oxygen poor because we've dropped it all off. Then these capillaries here will merge together to small, what we know are called small veins, which are venules, which then become veins, which will bring blood back to the heart through large veins called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, bringing blood into the right atrium, and then the entire cycle begins again. So effectively what we have is one side of the heart that pumps blood to the lungs and one side of the heart that pumps blood to the rest of the body. And so it lives up to its reference as being or acting as a double pump. You will also hear the terms pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit. Pulmonary circuit refers to, let's go back one, refers to the circulation of blood at the levels of the lungs, because pulmonary refers to lungs. The systemic circuit refers to the system, so blood moving through our body system, so from the heart to the rest of the body and then back to the heart again. So what this has told us is that blood is going to ultimately want to get to all of our body tissues so that they can survive. And if anywhere along this line blood supply is cut off, then tissues do not get the oxygen for survival and they can start to die. So this refers to all tissues in the body. But what about the heart itself? The heart itself, we know, is a muscle. It's made of a muscle called myocardium. What happens to the heart muscle? Where does it get its blood supply for survival? Well, it has its own circuit that exists, and these are referred to as the coronary arteries. And so you can see all of these arteries present, the blues representing veins, the reds representing arteries, and these arteries are going to supply the heart muscle itself with blood for survival. So how does the heart get its supply then into these vessels? Well, it's actually a really neat setup. Remember, now we're looking at the outside of the heart, whereas in our previous images, we were looking at a cross-section or a frontal or coronal view of the heart, so we could see the inside of the heart. But now we're looking at the heart as a whole. So hopefully you can identify that this is the right atrium, that this is the right ventricle, that this is the left ventricle, and this is the left atrium, and that these are your pulmonary arteries and this is your aorta. So if you look closely, you can see that branching off the aorta is this vessel. And so what happens through a variety of different built-in mechanisms is when the body pumps, the heart pumps blood out of the left ventricle and into the aorta to go to the rest of the body, we steal a little bit of our own blood supply for the heart. Now, there's quite a lot of clinical relevance to this slide because when we talk about the coronary arteries, all of these arteries here, if somebody, let's say, has a very poor diet, they're overweight, they don't exercise, and this artery here, if blood should normally flow nicely through it in one direction, what happens when we get all this kind of junk on the outsides, fatty deposits that build up? Well, it narrows the vessel. So instead of it being this size, blood can only move through maybe a smaller amount. Eventually, it can be entirely blocked off. And so if blood supply is blocked off here, then every area distal to it or further away, so I'm circling here the muscle tissue, will not get the oxygen that it needs. And what is this referred to as? Well, it's referred to as a heart attack. This is just to show you what I was pointing at earlier, that this is where our heart will steal some of the oxygenated blood for its own survival. Remember earlier in this lecture, I had mentioned to you that in order for any muscle to contract. There has to be an electrical signal or a nerve signal from our nervous system communicating with that muscle and essentially telling it to contract. So the heart itself then has to have a conduction system, an electrical conduction system in place to allow for the muscles to contract. This here, the pinkish reddish region, this is that myocardium or the heart muscle. You can see that it's larger on the left side. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, it's the left side of the heart that has to be strong enough to pump blood to the entire body. Whereas what does the right side of the heart have to do? It only has to pump blood through these pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and we know that our lungs are located on either side of the heart. So it doesn't need to have as large and strong of a muscle because the blood doesn't have to move as far. The yellow structures, looking at this coronal view or frontal view of the inside of the heart, are representing the nerves, the conduction system of the heart. So we have to have a nerve signal in order for a contraction to occur. The heart is spectacular because it has this built-in system that starts the electrical signal. And it all begins with this node called the SA node. It's called the sinoatrial node, or SA node for short. It's the heart's pacemaker. So it sets the pace. So we have this action potential that is generated within the SA node that spreads throughout the heart, allowing for a heart contraction, muscle contraction, to occur. And of course, it's the contraction that allows for the pumping itself, or the movement of blood. You can make note that the SA node, or the pacemaker, is located within the right atrium of the heart. So what will happen is this action potential will be generated, and then it will be spread throughout all of these what are called conducting fibers, atrial conducting fibers, that allow for the impulse to spread all throughout both atria. So it spreads very fast throughout both of your atria. And then once this electrical signal spreads through, we refer to it as depolarizing, then we'll end up with a contraction of the atrium muscles, which are much smaller muscles because blood only has to move from the atria into the ventricles. They don't need to be as large. What's interesting, and this might be something you wouldn't have thought, both atria contract at the same time. So the top part of the heart then contracts at the same time. That's how fast that signal will spread through, followed by a contraction. Blood will then move into the ventricles because we know that that's their next stop. Then, with this electrical signal, after it's spread through the atria, the electrical signal gathers at another node. And this node is called the AV node. And it's called the AV node because it's located, AV is atrioventricular. It's located within the atria, but right at the level of the junction between the atria and the ventricle. So that electrical signal gathers in this region, and it actually slows down here. So this node slows the signal down. And the reason it slows the signal down is because we want to make sure that we've had a full top part of the heart contraction before anything happens in the lower part of the heart. So it slows it down, then the signal is going to travel to the bundle of His. The bundle of His is found right in the center part of the heart, so really in between each of the ventricles, and it will travel along here and up into the muscles. Then, once the signal reaches the muscle and the cells depolarize, then it will follow with a contraction. So you can see we have right and left branches here of these nerves, and then the nerves that sort of dip down into the muscle here are referred to as the Purkinje fibers. So it's because of this electrical signal that takes place that we end up with muscle contraction. So let's do a quick review. The SA node located within the right atrium is going to generate its own action potential, which will spread through all of these atrial conducting fibers, depolarizing the cells of the atrium. Both the right and left atria will then follow with a contraction. That signal will reach the AV node which is located within the right atrium as well, right at the junction of the atrium and the ventricle, and it will slow down here. Then the signal will travel to the center of the heart toward the ventricles, reaching what's referred to as the bundle of His, and then these right and left branches, which will then spread into these smaller branches of nerves that are collectively called Purkinje fibers. Then, once that signal reaches these muscle fibers and they depolarize, because remember a muscle cell is a muscle fiber, then both ventricles will contract at the same time, moving blood then at the same time out of the heart towards the lungs and out towards the rest of the body through the aorta. So in our final slide, we'll talk just a little bit more about the conduction system of the heart, which here's the image that we looked at on the previous slide. Let's say somebody is suspected to have maybe some problem with their heart. An ECG might be ordered, or an electrocardiogram. And if you haven't seen these yourself in person, you've certainly seen an image similar to this if you watch any show whether it's a medical drama or involves somebody being brought to the hospital with suspected heart issues. And what this graph is showing us is how the conduction system of the heart is functioning. Now, when you think back to learning about depolarization and repolarization in your nervous system lectures, a cell needs to depolarize, and then it will be followed by a contraction. And the state of repolarization is bringing it back to its resting state. And graphs like this are not showing you the heart's contraction, but rather sensors or electrodes that are placed on various areas of the arms and chest when there's a suspected heart issue and an electrocardiogram needs to be done, are not picking up the contraction, but are instead picking up the electrical signals. And we can assume then that if the electrical signals are functioning properly and they look as they should, then a contraction would follow these signals. So what we have here is what's referred to as a normal electrocardiogram. We have what these arbitrary letters that are given to represent the different waves or deviations from baseline. So this is just a straight line here. These deviations are called waves. So we have a P wave, we have the QRS wave, and we have, or it's called the QRS complex, and we have the T wave that are present. And this is what you would want to see. And this here represents one cardiac cycle or one pumping of the heart. So really what it's telling us is that if it's normal, that the conduction spreading through the atria and then through the ventricle is normal. And so then a contraction should, in theory, follow these electrical signals. So what we have first that you need to be aware of is the P wave. And the P wave represents atrial depolarization. And that's what I spoke about earlier, where the signal is being spread throughout the atrial walls, depolarizing it. Then what we have is the QRS wave, and you can see that this is rather large. And the QRS wave, it's not explicitly stated on this slide, oh yes it is at the bottom, represents ventricular depolarization. So this is where the ventricles are starting to depolarize now, getting ready for a contraction. But what's hidden and not really evident right within this QRS wave is what's referred to as atrial repolarization. All that means is that while the ventricles are depolarizing, the atria are repolarizing or returning to their resting state. Then finally we have the T wave, and the T wave represents the repolarization of the ventricles or returning to their resting state. So we have depolarization occurring throughout here, then we have depolarization occurring throughout here. We have, then of course the atria will have to repolarize, and that's hidden in the QRS wave, and the ventricles afterwards will also have to repolarize. So that is the end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening.